I grew up in a passive solar house. My father's been instrumental in the solar industry for years. And I spent probably 10 years working as an electrical engineer or a mechanical engineer, both, with electric vehicles. So I spent a lot of time doing alternative energy sorts of projects. I went to Kathmandu in the 90s, early 90s, and built a demonstration fleet of electric taxis. And now there are hundreds of these little three-wheeled electric taxis driving around Kathmandu that I built the first ones up there. My great-great-grandfather bought the Santa Rosa land grant, which was between Buellton and Lompoc, and it was about, it was probably 15,000 acres at the time, and I think he paid $5,000 for it. He paid 10,000. He put 5,000 down and then 5, so he paid $10,000 for 15,000 acres. And people thought that he grossly overpaid at the time. It was
My great-grandfather was an organic farmer like everyone was back then, you know, and then my grandfather's generation, boom, after World War II, here we go, here's pesticides and herbicides and this whole thought process that, hey, you sterilize the land, make it a petri dish, and then you put inputs in to grow whatever you want. Here's the input of the fertilizer, here's the input of the pesticide, the herbicide, and, you know, 2.5 generations of doing that, and we're finally getting wise to, hey, maybe we had something way back then before we did all this, and it's coming full circle, and it's exciting for our generation to be aware of that, be like, hey, we need to be fostering, you know, we're not farmers, we're not cattlemen, we grow soil. You know, that's the fundamental difference, is that we need to be growing soil, whether it's for fruits and vegetables or for, you know, livestock. It all comes down to having soil, you know, rich live soil.
all of this land was originally managed for sheep. And that's true of all of these ranches. Well, okay, originally during the rancho era, the Spanish days, there were cattle, but they were here for mostly for their skins. So the people in the local area ate the meat, but there was no refrigeration. So the meat was basically discarded and the hides were kept. And it was a leather producing region. And then in the 1860s, people like Joe Cooper, Hollister, and Dibley came out with a bunch of sheep, and they put their sheep grazing in the same areas that the cattle had been grazing. And they sold wool as well as a little bit of meat. Once again, same sort of thing where the locals ate the meat. And then that's how all these ranches were purchased from the original families who they'd been granted to, was from sheep proceeds.
There's nothing permanent to land use and county politics. There's no permanence to zoning. There's no permanence to land use in coastal California. It is at the whim of the changing wind of politics. And what we see today is a perfect example of that in the Santa Barbara County, where the wind has changed. You know, the winds of this community demographically are changing, that there's more of a split than ever between the northern part of this community and the southern part of the citified Santa Barbara County in the south. And that's likely to transform as well with new demographics. The politics of the day is that these big homes that, if they are built on the foothills, could lead to future subdivisions and rezoning and more dynamic development within the foothills area and within the coastal valleys of Gaviota. And that's the history of Southern California.
How do we do this? How do we not rezone to allow for development, but in somehow allow for the next generation to live on the land?
The biggest issue are the inheritance taxes, because normally with an inheritance tax, the property is passed on and assessed at its highest and best value, and so you have some heirs that come along and they can't afford to pay that given the fact that you got a cattle grazing operation on the land. But the landowner can place their land in a conservation easement that allows continued agricultural operations, and thereby the inheritance taxes will be valued at the value of the agricultural operation.
I'd like to live on the land and live a long life here with my family, and I think your question was posed more so at, you know, estate taxes or anything like that, and, you know, I don't labor over it too much. We'll cross that bridge when we get there, but, you know, I think there's a fundamental difference between say our situation where it's a family-owned and operated ranch for generations, and if it passes hands, you know, the difference between getting so heavily taxed on that that we're forced to sell the ranch to pay that inheritance tax versus, you know, some super wealthy family that owns, you know, second, third, fourth houses all over the world. You know, there's just a difference, you know. It's hard to say who should get taxed and who shouldn't, but, you know, if we look at it situation by situation, it's easy to understand, like, hey, that would be the worst thing to do, is for all these family-owned ranches to have to sell them just because they can't afford to keep them because of inheritance taxes. And that's when, like I said before, the only people that are going to be able to afford them is developers or the filthy rich that are going to put, you know, a 10,000 square foot home in. Then there's the, you know, 2,000 square foot garage and the pool cabana, this and that. You start adding up the amount of resources and impact that these are taking. It's like, shit, you might as well have 15 modest houses, you know. It's the same amount of resources. So, you know, we hope that doesn't happen. We hope we can figure out a way to keep this in the family and keep doing good stuff and turning people on to stuff that we've been turned on to, and see where it goes, you know.
The other problem I've got with large houses is, and large and spread out, is that they end up leading to a huge amount of paved surfaces and impervious surfaces. So it's bad for a watershed. One of the worst things that has occurred in the Gaviota Creek watershed is Caltrans, and it's because of all this paved road, and they keep paving more and more of the median and everything else, and it devastates the watershed, and it leads to much higher volumes of water going down the creek and out into the ocean during the rain events, and then there's no water storage directly underneath the pavement in the soil, and so it's sort of a flood or drought for the watershed. And I think that the 10,000 square foot houses along Naples would lead to more of the same. It's the same. I'm in favor of planning guidelines. I think it's important for the whole region to have a discussion on what kind of a community we'd like to see here, how we'd like to see development occur if it's going to occur.